Forum. I'm very glad to see you all here tonight to participate in the kind of free and open discussion the Cambridge Forum has been presenting here in Harvard Square for 46 years. Can you believe that? There's always something to talk about. And I'm Pat Zerke. I'm the director of the forum. And tonight we host Paul Bracken, a national security strategist from Yale University, discussing his new book, The Second Nuclear Age. That would be the one we're living in right now. Before we begin, let me take care of a few housekeeping details. There is information about Cambridge Forum on the table in the foyer where you came in. There is also a list there to which you can add your name, your address, your email address, if you'd like information about our future programs. And there's information about our support organization, the Friends of Cambridge Forum. It is thanks to the generosity of our friends, and you are all either friends or potential friends, that we have been able to mount these programs for free for 46 years. And in fact, tonight's program is co-sponsored by a longtime friend of Cambridge Forum who wishes to remain anonymous. So you can become a friend like that and be anonymous or be named. But we do thank our anonymous donor tonight. We have copies of our speaker's book for sale in the foyer to this room. After the program, I'm sure he'll be happy to sign a copy for you. And this is courtesy of our community partner, Harvard Bookstore. Cambridge Forum's programs, as you may know, are recorded and then edited and produced as half-hour radio programs that are distributed through the National Public Radio Distribution Network. They go out nationwide. In addition, tonight's program is being videotaped so that it can become a webcast on the WGBH Forum Network, which is now hosted on YouTube. So Cambridge Forum is on YouTube. We have stepped into the 21st century. Our forum tonight is moderated by Dr. James Walsh of the Security Studies program at MIT. His research and writings focus on international security and, in particular, on topics involving nuclear weapons and terrorism. Walsh has testified before the United States Senate on issues of nuclear terrorism and on Iran's nuclear program, and he's one of a handful of Americans who has traveled to both Iran and North Korea for talks with officials about nuclear issues. So after our speaker's formal remarks, he will open the dialogue, and then after his questions, he will invite you to ask your questions. And because our programs are recorded, we ask that you come forward and use this microphone here in the center aisle so that your question in your voice is recorded as well as the speaker's answers. And of course, by coming forward to the microphone, you're giving us permission to record you, edit you, distribute you, broadcast you, webcast you, etc., etc., etc. So we record everything except one thing. You know what that is. You can probably tell me faster than I can tell you. The ringing of your cell phone or other electronic device. So now is a good time to turn those devices off. And here's our moderator to introduce the program and the speaker.
Thank you. Well, welcome to Cambridge Forum. Tonight we're discussing The Second Nuclear Age with author Paul Bracken. I'm Jim Walsh from MIT Security Studies program, and I'm going to be your moderator. The optimism about the end of the nuclear threat that followed the collapse of the Soviet Union almost a quarter century ago has faded in recent years. Events have revealed a host of new nuclear risks. Unsecured and aging Cold War arsenals, expansion of the so-called nuclear club, rogue states, failed states, and non-state actors who may have nuclear intentions. So how can concerned citizens make sense of the new nuclear landscape? How much danger do these new threats actually pose? Have governments around the world developed effective strategies for coping with the new nuclear age? These are some of the questions our speaker, Paul Bracken, addresses in his latest book, The Second Nuclear Age: Strategy, Danger, and the New Power Politics, which is the focus of our discussion tonight. Paul Bracken is a professor of management and political science at Yale University. He is a member of the Council of Foreign Relations. He serves on the Chief of Naval Operations Executive Panel and co-chairs the Board of Advisors at the U.S. Naval College and the Naval Postgraduate School. Among his previous books are Fire in the East and The Command and Control of Nuclear Forces. Paul Bracken, welcome to Cambridge Forum.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Jim, and thank all of you for coming out on such a warm night when we all should be either jogging by the Charles River or I was amazed at seeing the rowing shells go down the Charles with lights on them, because rowing was my sport, and in those days we didn't have any lights. But I really would like to thank Cambridge Forum for inviting me up to talk about this most, sobering topic. And I think the way we'd like to proceed tonight is for me to give a brief overview of the thesis and illustrate it with some concrete details, and then of about 15 minutes. And then the bulk of it will be in conversation, Q&A. And I would encourage you, to ask whatever's on your mind about this. This is a subject of which I've been thinking about these things for a very long time, and there are no experts on them. There are specialists, but there are no experts. So your view of these matters is as good as anybody else's. Okay, let me sort of give the title of the book, which is itself kind of ominous, The Second Nuclear Age. If you didn't like the first nuclear age, we have a chance for a second. The first nuclear age, as you may have guessed, was the Cold War. And it can be pretty accurately dated with some debate, but say the late 1940s. It ends in 1991 or even a year or two before. But I define the second nuclear age, I thought about this quite a bit, as the era of the spread of nuclear weapons that have nothing to do with the Cold War. The spread of nuclear weapons for reasons that have nothing to do with the Cold War. That's the definition of what it is. There's what the bulk of my comments are going to be about what it means, which is different. But just to give a little bit of background on this, I look out on this audience and I see some people who probably do remember what I very well remember, which are duck and cover civil defense drills and air raid sirens. How many, raise your hands if you went through those. Okay, we're not done yet, because on the count of 3, you're all going to get under your chairs into that position that you were in. And remember the era after the civil defense drills of the 60s and 70s, when people started to think about civil defense. Let's see, there's Russian hydrogen bombs coming in, and I'm going to go under my desk. And we all heard the story about you lean over and kiss your butt goodbye. That's about all that they would do. And civil defense became to be seen as sort of one of the absurdities the United States government in particular was pushing its citizens in a direction of embracing, because they wanted to politicize the Cold War and have wider acceptance of it. And I think by the mid-1960s and afterwards, civil defense in the United States at least was seen as an example of the absurdity of government policy. And we don't have to refight the Cold War tonight, but I want to sort of introduce a thought, which is that if you were to go to Israel today, you would easily see Israeli children going into their shelters with gas masks, as they did in 1991 during the first Gulf War, when the threat was, of course, chemical, not nuclear attack. But this got me thinking that civil defense, while being completely discredited in the United States, is somehow back in Israel. And if you look at the situation over there, were Iran to acquire nuclear weapons, the Israeli civil defense program is geared very much to buttressing the bargaining power of the Israeli state if they get into a crisis with a nuclear Iran. So here's the insight I have. We tend to treat Iran as the most urgent case, but it's actually a much broader trend, the spread of nuclear weapons. And I define what it means, the second nuclear age, the spread of the bomb, for reasons that have nothing to do with the Cold War. But, what are the consequences of that? Well, one of the consequences is that nuclear weapons have returned for a second act, and they are now dominating the security politics and the foreign policies of three critical regions: the Middle East, South Asia, and East Asia. And when I look at this for reasons I'd be happy to go into, I would argue that nuclear weapons are now more entrenched in the world today than they were even in the Cold War. Because in the Cold War, you could have two superpowers, if you view the Cold War for a moment, with the fiction that was used at the time, that it was a bipolar competition. The two sides could communicate and bargain. They could sign arms control treaties. Now we have 9 nuclear weapon states, 9 and counting, I should say, if you believe as I do that Iran probably is on a path to get nuclear weapons. And to try to negotiate an agreement among 9 countries to disengage nuclear weapons from the world, it seems to me, is not, if not hopeless, and we should try, at least it raises other scenarios which we should consider, such as the argument and the bulk of what my book is about, which is how do you live in that world? How do you manage in a world where 9 nuclear weapon states have the bomb? What does it mean to have a nuclear context put on a particular region? Well, to answer that question, we could go back and look at the history of the first nuclear age. Now, in the book, I sort of play off the 2 nuclear ages. They're fundamentally different, but there are things which happen. I have a wildly subversive proposition. There's certain dynamics that came up in the first nuclear age, the Cold War, that will also come up in the second nuclear age. In addition, there's things which didn't come up in the Cold War, which you're likely to see in a second nuclear age. Let me just give you a couple of those. Let's go for the list, down the list first of similarities, things which happened in the first nuclear age, the Cold War, which in my view are very likely to happen again. And I have a long list of these, but the one that stands out to me is what I would argue is the most important single lesson of the Cold War, which is that you don't have to fire a nuclear weapon to use it. You don't have to fire a nuclear weapon to use it. Every single president, from Harry Truman to the first George Bush, who ruled the United States during the Cold War, hawk, dove, liberal, conservative, Republican, Democrat, played what I go through in the book is called nuclear head games. They played games with nuclear weapons, like hounding Soviet submarines, buzzing Russian airspace, firing missiles out of California 4 minutes after the Russians fired missiles out of East Asia to test their rockets, to signal Moscow that we could get off a shot before their missiles even touched down. All right. Now, back in the Cold War, we would do a lot of studies, including some that were done up here, and everybody would sort of solemnly condemn these actions, including senior government officials who did them when they were in office. It seems to me this lesson that you don't have to fire a nuclear weapon to use it is already being used in the second nuclear age, no matter how dangerous you and I may think that it is. So that's kind of a similarity. Let me just give you a couple more. It's very striking how the 2 superpowers in the Cold War did not understand their own forces. There's this view that containment and deterrence were established from on high in the late 1940s and were embedded into policy. This is any history of the Cold War that says that simply is not an accurate account of what happened. There was a tremendous amount of ongoing learning at a time when the 2 sides didn't understand their forces, and it was really, really dangerous because they did not understand their own forces, yet alone those of each other. Okay, so I view the second nuclear age, if you take that lesson from the Cold War, Pakistan and India simply do not understand their own forces. In my judgment, I'll be happy to go into this. I've spent a lot of time in Israel. Israel doesn't understand its own nuclear forces. The potential for accidents, for mishandling, for misperceptions is really, really high. Now, let me go through a couple differences of things which didn't exist in the Cold War but which do now, to give you sort of a flavor for answering this question, well, what difference does the second nuclear age make? I would say the key differences of which we have today, which we didn't have back then, is that it's a multiplayer game. It's a multiplayer game. That means the actions of one side can have a ripple effect through a number of different actors. Let me just give an example of something that's going on right now. It's an obscure example, but the United States is considering and very likely to pursue putting a conventional warhead on an ICBM or a submarine-launched missile in order to take out buried hard targets in places like North Korea and Iran. But when China looks at that, they see that conventional warhead, which the United States is pursuing because it doesn't want to use a nuclear warhead. It doesn't even want to threaten with a nuclear warhead. This threatens Chinese military forces, their nuclear weapons. So they're going to this big road mobile strategy, which means that we don't know where it is, so we can't target it. China goes down that road, and India looks at China and says, geez, the Chinese are building up their military forces, their nuclear weapons. We should too. And in fact, India tested an ICBM, the first country outside of the United States and the Soviet Union to test an ICBM in April of this year. Now, how do you think Pakistan looks at that? They see these longer-range missiles. They see all these other Indian programs, so they respond in the way they would like to respond. And it, potentially ripples all the way over to the Middle East. So it's a lot more complicated with multiple players. Another big difference is what I would call those of you who remember things or descriptions of the Cuban Missile Crisis 50 years ago, these intense feelings. At no time did you see 1 million people flood into Times Square screaming for the blood of the Russians, that these are an inferior, horrible people and they should be wiped out. At no time in the history of the Cold War were there any mass demonstrations in the Kremlin, in Red Square, during a nuclear crisis. And the reason was the two leaders of both sides, whoever they were, did not want to escalate hysterical popular passions, which could back them into a corner. Indeed, the United States went down a very different sort of road of detached rationality, which was as bloodless as it was absurd. It had other pathologies. The Soviets and the United States were extremely cautious on anything to do with nuclear weapons. At no time in the Cold War did either side ever seriously consider a calculated strike on the other. I don't see how anyone could possibly say that with respect to India and Pakistan today, with respect to North Korea, or with respect to Israel and Iran with nuclear weapons. I think the chances of serious consideration of a calculated strike on the other side, when I say serious, I mean not having paper plans. I mean that the political leadership will consciously think of a strike on the other side. I think it is extremely high. In this context of, what should we call it, nationalistic frenzy or hysteria? There's a big difference from the Cold War. One final difference, just to give you a flavor of things that are different now from the Cold War days, is terrorism. There was a lot of terrorism during the Cold War, but it had very prosaic purposes. Whether it was done in Vietnam, kidnappings in Europe, bombings in South America, torture in Africa. Okay, but the terrorism was not undertaken. Think of where we stand today. Think of what would happen if the Pakistanis sent a group in to shoot up Mumbai at the height of an Indian-Pakistani nuclear crisis. Think of what if an independent group did that? What if an independent group or a militia did it in the Middle East, where the purpose was to tip a tense crisis into a cataclysmic nuclear war? That is all too easy to imagine. Nuclear terrorism is one thing. We don't need nuclear terrorists to get what I'm talking about, which is to tip the violence into an all-out, to trigger a nuclear war. The way a high school chemistry experiment, where you add a little catalyst to some chemicals and it dramatically changes the nature of the reaction. Okay. So there's similarities and there are differences. Where I come out on this on the policy side is I find that the level of thinking about these issues has reached dangerously low levels. Only a handful of specialists pay any attention to it anymore. I actually think that the rhetorical embrace of a world free of nuclear weapons by President Obama and others, other Cold Warriors, I will point out one comment I made earlier, that the individuals like Henry Kissinger and George Shultz and Bill Perry and Sam Nunn, I wish they had done some of what they're talking about when they were in power, okay? The people that seem to be in favor of this are sort of people who are college students and old people. But the middle-aged, but anyway, that's a rant. So I will just say that this has sort of led people to believe that somehow it's all being solved. My friends, Pakistan is the fastest growing nuclear power in the world today. They have 3 plutonium factories and they're fielding tactical nuclear battlefield weapons. Okay? You look at the Iranian strategic posture, it is actually very cleverly designed, their missile force. They don't have any nuclear weapons yet, but it's going to be a bear to deal with in the event they do get nuclear weapons, and I would give you better than 50-50, personally speaking, that they probably will. So where do I come out on this? I think we need to raise the level of thinking about nuclear weapons to, if you will, think about the unthinkable, not nuclear strikes on others, but what does the United States do if others use nuclear weapons, and those others may as likely be allies as enemies of the United States? All right. I think arms control has played a tremendous role in dampening the Cold War, and it has a great future to play in the second nuclear age, but it needs to be reconceptualized. Why we continue to spend all of this time on the START Treaty, which is signed between the United States and Russia, which is designed to prevent a surprise attack on U.S. missiles. START takes a problem that isn't going to happen, because the Russians have no desire to do that and no capability to do it today. And it solves a problem that isn't going to happen. The Non-Proliferation Treaty, the other great arms control instrument, takes a treaty and fails to solve a problem that is happening, the spread of the bomb to North Korea and Pakistan. So I think there are major policy initiatives the United States could take, remodeling arms control, embracing a pledge of no first use of nuclear weapons, and possibly many other actions. But the big call is that we really have to start thinking about this kinds of problems, and it's very unpleasant and very dangerous. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions. Yeah.
Let me intervene here, Paul, and remind everyone that you're joining us here at Cambridge Forum as we continue our discussion of the second nuclear age with Yale University's national security strategist, Paul Bracken. How do the threats of the second nuclear age, the one we're living in at the beginning of the 21st century, differ from the nuclear threat of the Cold War? So, Paul, I'm going to abuse the privilege of the chair and ask the first question. But first, let me congratulate you on a fabulous book. It's clearly written, it's direct, it's a topic that's often bogged down in jargon and confusion, and it's really wonderful, and it's got wisdom, it's got some controversy and some contrariness that'll probably come out as we talk. But let me begin with this question. It sounds like you're saying that the second nuclear age, look out, second nuclear age is going to be dangerous. Skeptics might respond, hey, we've heard this story a bunch of times since the dawn of the nuclear age. Everyone predicted that nuclear weapons would spread like wildfire. We'd have 30 or 40 nuclear weapon states. There would be uses of nuclear weapons, tactical uses of nuclear weapons, and things turned out differently. That the spread of nuclear weapons, the pace of that peaked in the 1960s, and then since the 1960s, the rate of spread has declined. We don't live in a world of dozens of nuclear weapons, and we live in a world where every time there's been a crisis, the non-proliferation regime has grown stronger. So that today, international institutions have possibilities that were unthinkable in the 1950s, and that the number of countries that are seeking nuclear weapons is smaller than it has ever been in the nuclear age. So there's a good news story here. Now, is that a good news story that you disagree with, or that they or coexists with the set of dangers as we enter a second nuclear age?
I would say there's a little bit of disagreement and some coexistence in the following terms. The widespread predictions that the nuclear weapons would spread like wildfire, in my judgment, don't exist. They never happened. The famous one is President Kennedy. We have has said that there would be something like 30 or 40 countries with the bomb by the 1970s. This was an off-the-top-of-the-head remark based on a study that we now have. It's on the internet, which was very hypothetical and very cushioned, and it failed to understand the difficulty of getting fissile material. The best estimates I have come across were of how fast nuclear weapons were spread were some obscure articles in California Law Review by Herman Kahn in the 1960s, when he predicted that there would be no major spread of nuclear weapons from the 1970s for 20 years, with the possible exception of India. But after 20 years, it would accelerate and it would pick up. Not to everybody, but to enough dangerous countries, enough that we should worry about it. And I think that's exactly what happened. As to where I would coexist with that, I mean, I am not here to say nuclear weapons will spread and every country will get them. You may not be aware of this. There's an academic argument out there which says that the world would be more stable if every country had nuclear weapons. And I would say this is just an example of how far removed from reality some academics, particularly Ivy League social scientists, can become when they're protected by tenure or need to impress the tenure committee. My problem is not that Uruguay or Guatemala or the Vatican is going to go nuclear. It's that Pakistan already has and has doubled the size of her arsenal, and really dangerous dynamics are building up there, which are swamping or laid on top of all of the old problems, Kashmir, or if you take the Middle East, all the ones we're all too familiar with. That they will, you get both of them, and they're going to profoundly change those political problems, which have been around for a long time, mainly by putting a nuclear context on them, making them a lot more dangerous. And I'd come back to something I said earlier about fire. You don't have to fire a nuclear weapon to use it. I have played in war games which went to insane levels of threat and danger and destabilization of countries, and not a nuclear weapon was fired, not a single shot was fired. Because you can threaten these things to really undermine the societal cohesion of your enemy, and people have really long thought about that. So even if deterrence were to work, that only gets you off the hook to a limited degree.
You're listening to Paul Bracken discussing his new book, The Nuclear Age, Strategy, Danger, and the New Power Politics at Cambridge Forum. So we've been yakking up here a long time. It's probably time to give you a break, give you a chance to ask questions. And so let's take some questions from the audience, if you're so brave. Line up at the microphone, and you should know that I'll be the traffic cop. I'm notorious for being an ugly traffic cop. So, keep it brief so that we can get as many questions as we can in here, and hopefully there's a question in there. After you, sir.
Now I'm really scared. So my question is this. The first non-proliferation treaty was successful in many ways, but also not successful in other ways that many nations, especially outside of the industrialized nations, did not sign on to it. What is your vision of what a second version of the non-proliferation treaty might be, that might have more political attractiveness and legs, and especially in the context, as you have alluded to, of unstable regimes such as we have in Pakistan and in Iran and in North Korea and those kind of contexts?
Right, good. Yeah, the widely held view is that the Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1968 bought us 10 or maybe 20 years. I'm not actually of the view that it did. I don't think the technological ability for the bomb to spread was all that great in those 20 years. Let me just give an example. Pakistan in 1970 manufactured bicycles, but did not have the engineering skills to manufacture the chains to put on the bicycles. So countries back then, even if they wanted to go nuclear, found it very, very difficult. I think almost anything would have worked, and I'm perfectly prepared to lay great claim of victory for the Non-Proliferation Treaty for the reasons you point out to in the second part of your question, which is what's the follow-on act, so to speak, okay? I think the follow-on act is fascinating, and we're seeing it right before our eyes, but nobody points it out. And that is, I think, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, for those of you who are not familiar with the minutiae of these things, asserts that there are 5 legal nuclear weapon states: the United States, Russia, China, France, and Britain. In fact, the victorious powers of World War II. Everyone else who signs it agrees not to get the bomb. Okay, it's been violated in case we know about, and it's failed to stop the spread of the bomb to countries who did not sign it. I think what is emerging is a replacement for the non-proliferation regime composed of 200 countries or something like that. And what we're going to move into is a great power arms control system. That is to say, the major powers will be forced to deal with this horrible threat of the spread of nuclear weapons. And one way to look at the second nuclear age is that it's the breakdown and the monopoly of nuclear weapons by the major powers. So what do I mean by this? Let me just give a couple of examples that all of the major powers, US, China, India, Russia, France, and Britain, who are nuclear powers, have either no first-use policies or de facto no first-use policies like the United States. All have thick political controls on their forces.
What do you mean by no
not promising that they will not use nuclear weapons first under any circumstances whatsoever. All right. The United States has a de facto no first-use policy. We are not going to use nuclear weapons first. We have not formally signed on to that. To me, that's a detail. All have taken extraordinary measures to prevent accidental war. There's an image out there the public has that the United States has all of these weapons on hair trigger alert, and if a Canada geese or a transistor blows, a colonel can launch the forces. This is complete nonsense. I mean, I work at Stratcom. I go out there. They are so far away from firing nuclear weapons you couldn't believe it. It raises the question of why do we have these things? They're so far away from that. And I could go down the list, but the broader point is, in the last few weeks, we've seen Russia give the nod to private discussions between the United States and Iran. We've seen China make positive moves. The major powers don't want the bomb to spread to secondary powers. It's not in their interest. And I think this is going to coalesce under perhaps the mask of a non-proliferation regime composed of a more democratic set of countries. But in fact, it's really the great powers acting in concert.
Next question.
Hi, I've always been curious about nuclear weapons and EMP, so that you get the effects of crippling a country, but you don't get the pictures of the bombed out buildings. So
EMP stands for electromagnetic pulse. And these are strong radiation waves which are produced by a wide range of explosives, but many nuclear explosives. And the radiation comes down. You burst 2 or 3 of these at high altitude over a country, and they are said to knock out the electronics. And there is reason to believe the Russians built one of these in the Cold War. We had simulators to test our weapons. Astonishingly, it looks like France actually built and deployed one of these weapons. The uncertainty about EMP would make it not very attractive to any decision maker. And the thought that, the scenario that's very popular is that Israel will burst one of these over Iran to knock out the electronics. I don't think the Israeli military or the political leadership would view that as a reliable enough way to take out those forces. They may fire one of these things as part of a general attack to sort of mess up the other side more, but it's simply too uncertain.
Before we take the next question, let me jump in here. You mentioned Israel and Iran. You said that you thought it was more likely than not that Iran would eventually acquire a nuclear weapon of some kind. And I know you write about the book, in the book about it. So what's your take on, there's a lot of talk about military strikes against Iran. What do you think about that as an option? What do you think we're looking at if other options don't work?
My personal view, and others will defer, is that a military strike to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon leads to so many incalculable consequences that I personally would be strongly opposed to it. Number 2, I would make a call that Israel will not launch a strike on Iran because they can't possibly, I don't think they have the military wherewithal to execute it. And I really looked into this carefully. And I think when the United States considers all of the major uncertainties, all right, and the biggest uncertainty isn't, I mean, it's just, there was a war game in Israel played a week ago called The First 48 Hours of a War with Iran. Let me take my word for it. The first 48 hours are going to be a cakewalk. It's like the first 48 hours of the war against Iraq or Afghanistan. It's like the person jumping off the building and saying the ride is okay so far. Nothing's going wrong. If you launch a strike on Iran, you are signing a contract, you, the United States, in my judgment, for periodic restrikes every 2 years for the rest of history. You are opening up the floodgates to major kinds of escalation, which will compel the United States to go into an all-out war with Iran. Closing down the Persian Gulf will threaten energy security. Political attacks on friendly regimes to the United States will turn this into a regional Cold War. And the United States will be sucked into a long war that will make the Vietnam War and the Iraq War, in my judgment, look short. And so we really need to think about the long war aspects of this and the dangers associated with that, not simply a narrow focus on the question of Iran getting nuclear weapons.
Next question, please.
What are the questions that you think citizens need to be asking as this unfolds in the years ahead? You've said that the issue is how do we live in this world, and one of my theories is there was no greater failure leading up to the Iraq War than that we, the people, just watched and didn't ask enough questions. So what are the questions we have to keep asking to keep the lid here?
That's a really good point, and there's groups like this and institutions, whether they be think tanks or universities or that kind of group had an enormous impact on the Cold War, okay? You remember, if you go back and you look at the early nuclear strategists, people like Henry Kissinger, Herman Kahn, Tom Schelling, what was their real effect? We could get into a discussion of whether what they did was right or wrong, their policies. They did something much more important than that. They broke the government's monopoly on the conversation. And they opened it up for the introduction of political and moral considerations that the government itself wasn't looking at and was incapable of looking at. So this breaking the monopoly the government has, where you look behind the Wizard of Oz, the curtain there, and there's not a lot going on, let me tell you, okay? There's not a lot of deep conceptualization on these things. They want them to go away. They want to avoid controversy. So anything which generates pointed questions, particularly moral and political questions, I think can have disproportionate impact because it's exactly those sorts of questions which are not being asked today.
Terrific. Next question.
Yes, I actually have two questions, if I could. You contend that we're very far away from actually launching nuclear weapons, but my understanding is that many of our missiles are still on a launch-on-warning posture, which I know you've written about in the past. So is that not the case? It seems to me that many are on launch-on-warning.
I know for a fact that they are not on launch-on-warning, that if you want a description of the real command and control system of the United States today, think of the nuclear buttons and the forces. Somebody went with wire cutters and clipped the wires. Not only are we not on launch-on-warning, we have not done a realistic nuclear exercise since the end of the Cold War. More. How many real missiles do you think the United States have launched in test firings with dummy warheads from real silos in history? Exactly 3. One in 1965 and it went off. 2 in 1967 was the last time we tested real missiles, and both failed to launch. I get concerned about this because we have this image to the world that we're about to launch nuclear hell when it couldn't be further from the truth.
Well, why is it the case that no one that I'm aware of in the government or even in academia has made the argument that, in fact, don't worry about it, we're not on launch-on-warning? I mean, I've seen that reference to the fact that we are in numerous places, and yet this is the first time I've heard anyone say, in fact, we're not on launch-on-warning.
I will stand on this. It is factually incorrect that we are on this. Why is this? Boy, there's been a handful of proponents of this who have really gotten a lot of attention with it, mixing up arguments about the Cold War when we could have been. I don't think we ever were, but we could have been, and we considered it, with a radically different situation today. Launch-on-warning is also something that Pakistan could do and North Korea could do, and there's good reason to think that they are. You did not ask that question, I understand, but it's something which is out there, and I wanted to plant in there.
Let me follow up on that and ask about, you've mentioned Israel, you've mentioned North Korea, Pakistan, and India. You know, when people ask me about what's the most dangerous country in the world, I say my top 5 answers are Pakistan, 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 and Pakistan. Tell us something about that India-Pakistan state of nuclear standoff right now, and what's your take on that?
As to which is the most dangerous, I would say I really don't know, because they're all really dangerous. And on Tuesdays and Fridays, the answer is Pakistan. All right, let me go to Tuesday and Friday. The reason Pakistan is so dangerous is because it has a small nuclear force and inadequate command and control over it. One of the big differences between the Cold War and the second nuclear age is that in this world, we have technologies which can take out the missiles and command and control of the other side without firing nuclear weapons. This is through cyber attacks. This is through precision strike cruise missiles and other systems, monitored by stealthy drones. And the effect of stealth is to reduce warning time so the other side can't even get off a shot. All right. So let me just say a little bit more about Pakistan. Their command and control system, which they have published in excruciating detail, has something like 10 people in it. Now, can you imagine this group meeting in a bunker being shaken and somebody saying, we just had word that there's a missile coming in from India. We're not sure if it's nuclear or conventional. So I've asked my good friend, the Minister of Defense, to poke his head out of the bunker and see if he sees a mushroom cloud. All right. This is a system which can't possibly work. Pakistan almost surely has an alternate command and control system which is designed to confuse outside powers about the location and status of its nuclear weapons, because the United States and the Soviet Union had these in the Cold War for rather obvious reasons. In fact, the interesting thing to me about Pakistan is they even took the U.S. name for this system, the National Command Authority, which is what we called it, and they slapped it on this facade command system, I think to reassure India and the United States. So I am really worried about Pakistan, particularly on Tuesdays and Fridays.
Okay, brief second question.
Okay. I realize that you only gave a very short summary of your book, but if I understand the main thrust of it, you're saying that there hasn't been sufficient thinking as to how to manage a world with 8 or 9 nuclear powers, and you want to raise the level of thinking. You think it's dangerously low. But a few seconds ago you said, well, you have to take my word for it. I understand I'd have to read the book to get a full idea of your thinking on it, but I find it hard to believe that there aren't people in government who are giving serious thought to this. It's just, it's just inconceivable to me that there isn't sophisticated, deep thinking about this.
There's deep thinking about how to prevent this world by signing arms control treaties like START and the NPT. But as to questions about how would the United States, what should the United States nuclear arsenal look like, other than that it should be smaller, because we want others to give them up, I'll stand by my comment. As to what information we would transfer to an ally in a crisis, Israel, possibly India, I would say zero thought has been given to that. As to how you would de-escalate a nuclear crisis in any of the 3 regions we've talked about, where there was a serious possibility of nuclear weapons, what would one side do? How would we signal the other? I stand by my comment. I've not found a single paper written on that. I read a lot of this stuff. So I would stand by my comment on that. I really find how one would terminate a war that went nuclear between Israel and Iran before it went all the way. How the United States would deal with an Israel that detonated a nuclear weapon 100,000 feet over Tehran as a demonstration of its resolve that it would escalate if Iran continued. I would bet my reputation that there's not a single paper in the last 10 years in the United States government on that. So those are my views.
Let me follow up on that. So really in the book you're talking about several different things in terms of having an information deficit or an understanding deficit. You talk about questions that are not being asked. You also talk about the particularities of the Cold War, that there's a bias of the first thing that happens to you. People tend to overdraw lessons on some things and underappreciate other aspects. Can you say more about that?
Let me say more about this. This adds to the list of things which, in my view, not a single paper, like not even a bad paper has been written about these things. Okay, if you look at the Cold War, the learning of each side about how far they could go was not through staff studies, academic studies, it was through crises. And the 2 big crises were really the 1948 Berlin crisis and the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay? These crises had disproportionate impacts, not in the narrow sense that they could have gone and how you manage them, but that they set precedents that the other side would not violate in the future. For example, the Cuban Missile Crisis set the precedent, which was, don't give nuclear weapons to one of your allies, because they may have different goals from you, their goals may change, so don't give them those things. Now, so there's not a single study of the first nuclear crisis of the second nuclear age from the point of view of the conventions and precedents and red lines that it will establish for the future. It's looked at I would even argue there's not even much on how do you manage the crisis per se. I think you'd agree with me that the precedent-setting impacts of such a crisis could dwarf even the local aspects of it, of how it was managed, and will be a powerful determinant of what happens in the future as it was in the Cold War. So, yes, there's a whole raft of deeper, wider thinking that goes beyond deterrence, containment, and how do you prevent a second nuclear age. And boy, am I in favor of preventing it. I'm only arguing we have failed to do so, to get into the world, this whole world of how you manage it, how you keep the crisis as low as you can, which we sort of did in the Cold War, and that was really a very good thing to do.
Next question.
Thank you. I really appreciate your expertise on nuclear weapons and the whole introduction of the vocabulary of the second nuclear age. I fear, however, we may already begin what could be called, I suppose, the third nuclear age, which has less to do with weapons, much more to do with weaponry, and depleted uranium in particular that's been distributed through a lot of cities in the Middle East, and particularly Baghdad and Fallujah. We have a civilian population that's also aware of that through reading Al Jazeera. Beyond that, there's a great deal of nuclear waste that's readily available to anybody who wants to assemble a dirty bomb. Is there any discussion from your expertise about people who talk about nuclear weapons, first or second age, in this crowd about the coming third age?
Well, what you call a third nuclear age, let me just explain. The idea is you get a high explosive bomb and you put waste or radioactive material from depleted uranium shells or other sources, and you spread it around, and you can do a lot of damage. Not as great as an actual nuclear detonation, but you can do a lot of damage. There has been a fair amount of attention given to that, as there has been by the United States government to dealing with an actual nuclear terrorist detonation. But the crowd that looks at that has looked very seriously at the threat that you raise also of rad waste bombs, dirty bombs as they're called. And that gets into the whole world of homeland security, surveillance, intrusive technologies. That's usually the way the best response to that kind of threat is.
Yeah, and Paul, isn't it the case that when people write about radioactive weapons or dirty bombs, the general feeling is that more people will die from the conventional explosive blast than the exposure to some radiological material?
I believe that's right. The high explosive bombs could actually kill more people, like fertilizer bombs and that sort of thing.
Or that the bomb itself, of the dirty bomb, the conventional piece of the dirty bomb, would actually end up killing more people than the radiation, because people would move or whatever the case may be.
We're really happy to cheer everybody up with all this discussion here.
And that's a good news story.
One of the points made about this third nuclear wave would be that, in fact, it's not its explosive power that's of any interest at all. It can be 2 sticks of dynamite. What's important about cesium-137 or the like that can be dispersed is that it can't really register for 20 years on a population. And yet, it's considered a WMD, but it's a weapon of mass disruption in the sense that no one, especially after 9/11, will believe a government that says the air is safe. Right?
No, I mean,
now move
these are excellent points, and I would just add one that I think you would agree with, which is the distinction in the public mind between a dirty bomb and an actual one is likely to be blurred, so the immediate panic effects could easily occur and could be exploited by political forces for whatever advantage they wanted. I'm talking about forces in my government here.
Thank you. Next question, please.
Thank you. I have 2 questions, 2 quick ones. One is the doctrine of massive response. Is that still official doctrine? And the second question is, how realistic is the possibility of a truck being driven across the border with a nuclear bomb on it, or a rowboat in the harbor with a nuclear bomb on it? How realistic are those things?
The first question is what replaces, if it does, the doctrine of mutual assured destruction? Is that fair?
No, they used to have this thing called massive response. In other words, if something is incoming, you'd set off lots of euros.
The doctrine of massive response still exists, probably on paper, probably on a computer somewhere. But what I find is really interesting is the way nobody is particularly curious about it, because consistent with my view of the second nuclear age, the thought of a Russian surprise attack or a Chinese surprise attack on the United States, or us on them, is now so completely unthinkable that nobody really is interested in the question of what our strategy would be, what would we target. In fact, most experts I know, only a handful of specialists even know how many warheads the United States and Russia has, because it doesn't matter. These systems, we don't understand how they would work. The chance of a Russian attack on U.S. missile silos is to me well nigh inconceivable. The problem has shifted to the regions. And your second question was on?
The realisticness of a truck bomb or...
Oh, a truck bomb. There's estimates all over the place on this. Official estimates on such things have to be low, because if they were high, people would say, well, what are you doing about it? My own view is at the moment is that they're low, because it's very hard for non-governmental groups to get the fissile material to actually make a nuclear weapon. Not impossible because of leakage in the old Soviet-Russian system.
Let me follow up and ask a question about you're comparing the first nuclear age dominated by the U.S.-Soviet competition, in which you had superpowers who were thousands of miles away from each other, and that you're arguing that in the second nuclear age, regional concerns will predominate. Does geography matter here? Does it matter that the U.S. and the Soviet Union were so far apart, and that India and Pakistan are smack dab next to each other, that a North Korea and a South Korea are right next to each other? Does that matter?
I think the geography makes a big difference, because you didn't have direct contact, because of, fortunately, Canada and the Arctic kept the two sides apart. You sort of did have contact in Europe, and that's why that was particularly dangerous. But you do have direct contact, or direct contact has been built. Think of it this way. China and India historically got along very well because of the Himalayas. To fight a war between these two countries, I mean, they actually did fight a war in 1962. 10 times as many people have died from frostbite as from attrition in combat in any of these skirmishes. But the missile obviates that. Israel, when it developed its nuclear force, didn't have to worry about even Iraq, or yet alone Iran, because it was too far away. And North Korea posed no threat to Japan 10 years ago, because how would they get across the Sea of Japan? They didn't have a navy. I mean, they might have some commandos or something like that. But geography is a physical science and a social science. And on the social side, people are building technologies which are making geography smaller. The military systems that people are building in the Middle East, South Asia, and East Asia are now too big for the region. They can't fit them into the region. What do I mean? Iran's missiles can now reach Europe, okay? India's missiles can now go over the Himalayas and reach China. And China's forces can project into the Western Pacific. This is going to impose a huge defense economics burden on the United States unless we reconceptualize the problem. The idea that the United States is going to defend the Western Pacific and Japan, when you were dealing with a China that consisted of 400 infantry divisions and 25 combat ships, that was really cheap to do, because the troops couldn't walk across the Sea of Japan. All right. So the cost of this thing, I would just wish more people in the Pentagon would appreciate this. The cost of defending the Western Pacific and Japan against a high-tech threat, all right, is going to go through the roof, and we really need new diplomatic and arms control approaches there to forestall this partially senseless buildup.
Next question, please.
As a peace activist looking at Iran right now, I wonder what would you like to see activists doing right now about Iran?
I may get in trouble with my response to this
You
thing.
can turn off the microphone now.
No, I think there's a lot that peace activists can do. I think that that 83-year-old Catholic nun who was arrested at Oak Ridge, September, was it? Because she trespassed on, which she had 3 or 4, I think she was the youngest in the group, but there was 3 or 4 peace activists, and they cut through a wire fence. I'm not advocating this. At the Y-12, that's where we keep our enriched uranium, there, all right? And guess what happened? The cameras weren't working, and she was there for several hours, all right? Now, I would offer this as evidence of how little thought and taking nuclear weapons seriously is in the United States government. They've outsourced the contract with expected results, okay? Yeah. I think there are deep moral and political questions that could be asked but are not being asked, and I wouldn't even expect the government to do this, but I would expect the Catholic Church to do it, which it really very actively pursued in the Cold War and up into the Pastoral Letter and War and Peace in 1983, because it raised the deepest issues I'm aware of about U.S. dependence on nuclear weapons. I don't see anybody raising those questions anymore. And I'm talking about of an intellectual. There's demonstrations against nuclear weapons and things like that. But a more probing set of questions that the government that I know would be incapable of answering. All right, and it could really generate a much wider political debate about what the hell we're doing.
That night, again, this issue of the future and going forward. What are the questions that we should be focusing on that we're not? What's the core message you have for readers and listeners about what we should be doing, trying to grapple with your notion of the second nuclear age?
The core questions I would say are several. Let me just give 3. 1, what are the crisis and escalation dynamics in the region when all of the old political disputes play out going forward in a nuclear context? Second set of questions I would ask are, what are the moral and political foundations of U.S. policy? Not, I mean, political in the deep sense that we could offer a vision to the world that they would actually sign on to, not one that we personally believe and then choose to project onto them, which they will never accept. And finally, to explore what it means to restrain countries using new alliances among the major powers, even ones we don't get along with, but instead of looking at them as bad guys, how can we work with them to defuse a lot of the regional problems? How can we work more closely with Russia and China? I think there's a great potential to be payoff there.
Well, thank you for a wonderful talk, and I hope you all join me in thanking Paul Bracken.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I did that despite the dig he made at social scientists from around this area. You have been listening to a program of the Cambridge Forum, recorded in November 2012, co-sponsored by the First Parish in Cambridge Unitarian Universalist, the Lowell Institute, and the Friends of Cambridge Forum. For a CD of this forum entitled The Second Nuclear Age, featuring Paul Bracken, or for additional information about our Forum Network broadcasts, visit us at cambridgeforum.org. In Harvard Square, I'm Jim Walsh. Thanks for joining us.